Iconic. Forgotten. Timeless. Innovative. These are the soundtracks that help shape and define what we hear in the video games that we play. I am Nitro, and this is the M-Disc Playlist Video Game Music Primer 80s Edition. Before the first Sonic, Sega's most iconic game was Altered Beast. You are resurrected by Zeus to save Athena from the creatures of the underworld, led by their leader, Neph. When the Sega Genesis was first released, Altered Beast was packed with the console until Sonic the Hedgehog's release. Toru Makabayashi was most notable for his contributions to some of Sega's most memorable arcade titles, like Alien Syndrome, Golden Axe, which will be covered later in the episode, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, Time Scanner, and Thunderblade. Altered Beast was ported to most of the then current consoles of that time, arranged by several different composers. The Genesis version was arranged by Kazuhiko Nagai, who went by the alias Nav. The music in the Amiga port was arranged by David Lowe, aka Uncle Art. The Famicom version was arranged by Michiya Hirasawa, aka M. Kamijima, and Kenji Ino. The PC Engine version was arranged by Metal Yamashita and Fumina Murahoshi. The Commodore 64 version completely omits all of the music from the game. Other versions of the game didn't give credits to their staff, including the arrangers of Makabayashi's score. The gameplay for Altered Beast hasn't aged over the years, but Altered Beast still remains a symbol of the pre-Sonic era of the 80s. The game has been referenced in popular TV shows like Parker Lewis Can't Lose, to movies like Wreck-It Ralph, and even podcasts like The Last Podcast on the Left. Sega knew how to make an exciting arcade experience, and Altered Beast was just one of many that would help define their prominence in the 80s. It was at this time that the Batman franchise as a whole saw a resurgence in its popularity, thanks in part to Frank Miller's 1986 graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns and Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie. With the success of the Batman movie came the obligatory video game adaptation. Sunsoft at that point was a key developer for Nintendo, releasing titles such as Blaster Master and the Nintendo port of Sega's Fantasy Zone. In the 90s, Sunsoft would be known for more titles based on properties owned by Warner Brothers. This game was one of the benchmark titles for Sunsoft and their games based on Warner Brothers properties. To help enhance the experience of this game, Sunsoft used one of their primary composers, Naoki Kodaka, to help with the score. Kodaka had been playing the piano since he was a child, and always enjoyed learning how to play what was popular at the time. He studied at the Aichi Prefectural University of the Arts, and then after graduation, became a composer for radio and television. He was introduced to Sunsoft through a friend who considered Kodaka as this young composer who plays at the game center all day. While many video game composers of this era had issues with the limitations of the sound chips within the consoles they composed music for, Kodaka had nothing but praise for the Sunsoft team and their ability to go beyond what sound chips were capable of at the time, according to the ROM cassette disc in the Sunsoft liner notes translated by Shmuplations. He would write the music on sheets, and his team would translate his notes and would adjust the music based on his feedback. In 2002, Kodaka retired from composing video game music and became a music theory and computer music instructor at Daido University. There were multiple Batman video games released in the late 80s and early 90s. The Batman game released for the Nintendo, to coincide with the Tim Burton movie, is considered one of Nintendo's best games based on a movie. The music didn't try to replicate Danny Elfman's score from the movie, nor did it try to tack on music just to rush out a product. Effort was put into every aspect of this game, including the music. Bosconian has been around for nearly the entirety of the 80s. First released in 1981 for the arcade, then ported to the MSX in 1984, then the Sharp X1, and in 1988, the Sharp X68000, which contains this very soundtrack. Hideo Nagata served as the primary composer for this version of the game, which completely omits any of the music used in the original arcade release, composed by Nobuyuki Onagi, save for the blast-off soundbites. Nagata got his start in the video game industry working on this game, Ys 2 Ancient Ys Vanished the Final Chapter, and Sophia. His work on the X1 series of hardware was well received among video game music enthusiasts. He would later go on to compose music for the PlayStation games Motor Tune Grand Prix and the games in the Fighter's Destiny series. Yuzo Koshiro composed a handful of pieces for this game: Blast Power, Flash Flash Flash, and Asteroid Memory. Koshiro got his start in the video game music industry composing for Nihon Falcom. The X68K port of Bosconian was one of the first games Koshiro helped compose as a freelancer after leaving Nihon Falcom. He would also work on the PC-88 game The Scheme and the PC-98 game Misty Blue, both showcasing Koshiro's signature style of Eurobeat-inspired music. This was all before he became one of the most notable composers in video games with his scores for the Streets of Rage series, the Shinobi series, and the ActRaiser games. Bosconian was originally just another arcade shooter with barely any music. The X68K provided the opportunity for the classic arcade shooter to be amplified with the kind of music that was considered ahead of its time when compared to other video game systems that relied on FM synthesizers for their music. Castlevania started as Konami's light-hearted way to present one of their versions of a highly difficult NES action platformer. Light-hearted in the sense that you were a 17th century hunter named Simon Belmont who fought his way through Dracula's castle to fight other monsters based on Universal Studio properties and several of their minions. Both composers of the first game, Kinyo Yamashita and Satoe Terashima, worked under the single pseudonym James Banana. The alias itself is a satirical reference to James Bernard, who composed the 1958 version of Dracula. Yamashita has studied music since she started playing the piano when she was 4 years old. She joined Konami in 1986 after graduating from Osaka Electro-Communication University and got her first video game composition job, the first Castlevania. This would be the only Castlevania game she worked on, as she left Konami in 1989 to become a freelance composer. Terashima's resume is not as researchable as Yamashita's, due to Konami's stance on preserving the personal histories and bios of their employees. Terashima is, however, known for composing one of, if not the most iconic piece of the entire Castlevania franchise, Vampire Killer. Terashima would return to the Castlevania series to help compose the second NES game, Simon's Quest. Simon's Quest turned the Castlevania action platformer gameplay into more of an exploration-based platformer, similar to Metroid. These titles would soon be the foundation that would help inspire the production of Symphony of the Night, which helped coin the term Metroidvania. However, despite Metroidvania becoming a popular term to describe a 2D open-world platformer, it wasn't Metroid that inspired Simon's Quest. It was Konami's own MSX game, Maze of Gallius. The score for Simon's Quest was smaller than the original Castlevania, but it did introduce another iconic piece to the franchise, Bloody Tears. Bloody Tears was specifically composed by Kenichi Matsubara. Alongside Koji Murata, the three composers of Simon's Quest were credited under the Konami Kukeiha Club name, the name used by Konami quite frequently for their in-house musicians, again, to protect personal information and resume from being leaked to other companies. The third game, Dracula's Curse, used a new set of composers, again collectively credited officially under the Konami Kukeiha Club name. While the composers of Vampire Killer and Bloody Tears were easy to identify, the Konami Kukeiha Club alias makes it difficult to specifically identify who composed the signature piece from Dracula's Curse, Beginning. Vampire Killer from the first game, Bloody Tears from the second game, and Beginning from the third game have all been rearranged and reprised in numerous Castlevania titles for years to come. The original release of Dracula's Curse allowed for extra sound chips to be supported, making the score more rich and vibrant when compared to the previous two soundtracks. Hidenori Mizawa helped create a VRC6 coprocessor chip which allowed for 2 extra pulse wave channels and a saw wave channel to help enhance the score past the Nintendo's limits. However, outside of Japan, Nintendo systems could not support the additional sound chips. Thus, Yoshinori Sasaki had to compress the entire score down from being played on 8 sound channels to 5 for Western releases of Dracula's Curse. The effort placed into Dracula's Curse wasn't just to show off how much they could push the Nintendo's limits. It was simply to show that they could make a game that looked and sounded better than Konami's own Ninja Turtles games, which Konami prioritized over all their other titles at that point. Castlevania as a series thrived on music with each release and thrived on memorable yet difficult gameplay, all set to a gothic aesthetic that proved to be a major success for Konami in the 80s, leading to continued support of the franchise going forward in the 90s and beyond. Before Arnold Schwarzenegger, Carl Weathers, and Jesse Ventura fought the extraterrestrial in a jungle, Bill Rizer and Lance Bean fought an entire horde of aliens and the terrorists that they possessed. The original Contra arcade game was released in February 1987, composed solely by Kazuki Muraoka. Muraoka was both a sound designer and programmer for Konami. He got his start in 1986 with the game Rock in Rage. He only worked on the first 2 Contra arcade games. He would, however, be known for his involvement as a sound director in the Metal Gear franchise starting in 1998, as well as being a sound programmer for the Beatmania franchise. When the arcade game was ported to the Nintendo, Muraoka's music was arranged by both Hidenori Mizawa and Kiyohiro Sada. The Nintendo port of Contra is arguably the more iconic of the 2 versions, for both its, at the time, innovative multiplayer, and as being one of the first titles in Konami's library to feature the infamous Konami code, up, up, down, down, left, right, beat A. That code would commonly appear in various early Konami games, and would reward the player with anything from extra weapons to extra lives to stage skipping. One of Mizawa's biggest achievements working for Konami may have been the design of the VRC6 chip to help enhance the audio of Castlevania III Dracula's Curse. His programming skills were essential to Konami, as he was hired to help port the sound of Konami's arcade games to the more limited home consoles. The programming and composing skills complemented each other very well in the porting of Contra. Assisting Mizawa was Kiyohiro Sada, who also had both the composing and programming experience to help arrange Muraoka's soundtrack on the Nintendo. Sada did not stay in Konami for long, as he would join Natsume in 1989, making a bigger name for himself working on games like Abadox, Scat, Spanky's Quest, and arguably his most popular score for Natsume, Idol Hakkenden. Contra helped develop Kazuki Muraoka's skills as a composer, skills necessary to lead the sound design team for a franchise as big as Metal Gear Solid. The Nintendo port of Contra helped Hidenori Mizawa and Kiyohiro Sada show how they can take an original arcade composition and make it sound just as good on home consoles, despite how limited the Nintendo's sound was. It was an innovation all around, not just for people who got a co-op multiplayer experience at home, but for composers who look to push the Nintendo's sound capabilities beyond its limits. Kazuo Morita, founder of game developer Random House through Enix, made a game called Morita Kazuo no Shogi. It was considered one of the best authentic shogi experiences released on the PC. The game was good enough to attract the attention of Koichi Sugiyama, who at the time was known for his scores for the 1979 Cyborg 009 anime, the entire Space Runaway Ideon franchise, and the anime film The Sea Prince and the Fire Child. Sugiyama sent Enix a response to a questionnaire, and the staff at Enix were stunned that such a prestigious composer would even acknowledge them. They were so impressed with his strong but well-written criticism of the game, they invited him to compose for them, and he accepted. Sugiyama would compose the games World Golf and Wingman 2 before composing the score that would define his career more than any of his previous scores, Dragon Quest. It wasn't immediately known at the time, but Dragon Quest would end up becoming a monumental inspiration to the entertainment culture of Japan, the video game industry, and of course, the direction composers took or would take for their video games. Live performances of the Dragon Quest score were released on CDs featuring sheet music books, which were common bonuses for anime soundtracks released in Japan. And the Dragon Quest score was even performed in Japan's concert halls since 1987 through Sugiyama's Family Classic Concert Series, with the 1987 edition being the first live orchestrated performance of any video game score. The Family Classic Concerts would become precursors to Sugiyama's orchestral game music concert series, presenting the opportunity for game composers like Yoko Kanno, Koji Kondo, Nobuo Uematsu, Kohei Tanaka, Keiichi Suzuki, and so many others to perform their game scores live with an orchestra. The Dragon Quest score even inspired the first ballet based on a video game, performed by the Star Dancers Ballet in 1995. And in 2012, for Google's April Fool's gag, their Google Maps app was reformatted into an 8-bit overworld map, while the overworld theme from Dragon Quest played in the background. The outline of the Dragon Quest score would also inspire how role-playing games were scored. Recurring themes, like the overture that would play in the beginning of every Dragon Quest, which Sugiyama claims took only 5 minutes to score. Location themes, overworld themes, battle themes, and character themes were all musical tropes that helped enhance the Dragon Quest experience in a way that no story-driven game had attempted before. And it was all achieved through Koji Sugiyama's decision to express his opinion on a game that Enix helped produce. DuckTales marked the beginning of Capcom's partnership with Disney. In North America, they published Hudson Soft's Mickey Mousecapade in 1987. But in 1989, Capcom developed their first Disney title based off one of Disney Afternoon's most popular cartoons. What made DuckTales special, and what still makes DuckTales special to this day, was that this wasn't a quick and cheap cash-in. Effort was placed into every part of the gameplay. The way Scrooge McDuck traveled and fought his enemies, the non-linear ways you could play the game, the colorful graphics, and of course, the music. Many of which were from people who had prior experience working on Capcom's other popular platformer, Mega Man, except for Hiroshige Tonomura, who did not have any Mega Man experience. He got his start working on the arcade version of 1943 Kai, then worked on Capcom's version of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms story, Destiny of an Emperor. After DuckTales, he would work on Capcom's adaptation of the Japanese movie A Taxing Woman before leaving the studio to compose for Taito. Tonomura's most famous contribution to the DuckTales game, as well as arguably one of the most popular pieces composed in any Capcom game, was the theme for the Moon level. Frequently appearing in best-of lists, retrospectives, and the most commonly arranged piece arranged on Overclocked Remix, the theme for the Moon level alone helped make DuckTales one of the more memorable games in Capcom's library and one of the most memorable games based on a licensed property. The Moon theme became so iconic to DuckTales, it became a small part of the 2017 cartoon reboot. Part of the intro can be heard during the last episode of Season 1, and the character Della Duck sings a lullaby version of this song in the episode Whatever Happened to Della Duck, making this version the only official version of the Moon theme to contain lyrics. The arrangement was composed by Dominic Lewis, with vocals by Della Duck's voice actress, Paget Brewster. DuckTales set the bar for how video games based on licensed properties should play, look, and sound. The game did more than just supplement the popularity of the DuckTales series. It enhanced and added to it, with a soundtrack that went well beyond enhancing the game experience. It enhanced the entire DuckTales lore, and it became just as iconic as the game itself. Final Fantasy, a role-playing game franchise that pushed the limits of character development, storytelling, and music, began as a last-ditch effort to save Hironobu Sakaguchi's career. Sakaguchi had been making games since 1984, but none of them were hits for Square or Nintendo. Sakaguchi didn't know if he was meant to be a game designer. He had always wanted to make a role-playing game, but was initially turned down by Square for fear of losing profits. However, Square changed their mind when they saw how well the Dragon Quest series did for rival company Enix. The final in the name Final Fantasy was Sakaguchi's way of saying, "This may very well be the final video game I ever make." Like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy was inspired by games like Ultima and Wizardry. But unlike Dragon Quest, the battle system drew more heavily from Dungeons & Dragons, incorporating actual enemy weaknesses, which had never been done before in role-playing games at the time. This game saved Sakaguchi's career while simultaneously making Nobu Uematsu a household name. Uematsu originally did not intend to be a composer. He actually wanted to be a professional wrestler. He learned how to play the piano at an early age and made freelance music as a side job to earn some income. He worked at a music rental store close to Square, and when an employee heard a sample of Uematsu's music, he was offered a job. 3 of the pieces composed for this game became recurring leitmotifs for the entire series. Battle Scene, which incidentally is the only battle theme used in the entire game, has an intro that is used in almost every Final Fantasy game that Uematsu scored. In future re-releases of Final Fantasy, additional battle themes were added to avoid making the battles in the game too monotonous. The opening theme in this game is used as the music played during the text crawl in the beginning and during the staff roll. This piece would resurface in future Final Fantasy games, sometimes mixed in with their respective ending themes. The Prelude, otherwise known as the Crystal theme, the most recurring piece in the entire Final Fantasy franchise, and it was composed by Uematsu in 10 minutes, as a piece to be added to the soundtrack at the last possible second. The first Final Fantasy may not seem like much compared to future releases, but the first Final Fantasy wound up being one of the most influential titles in the role-playing game genre. One that would help shape the future of the genre, one that would solidify Hironobu Sakaguchi's career as a game designer and director, and one that would establish Nobuo Uematsu as one of the video game industry's most iconic composers. Forgotten Worlds was a huge undertaking for Capcom, rumored to have a $5 million budget and a 2-year development period beginning in 1986. It was Capcom's first arcade game using the CPS-1 board. The CPS-1 board would help Capcom develop games like Ghouls and Ghosts, UN Squadron, Final Fight, Magic Sword, and Street Fighter II. It was a coin-operated vertical scroller with some role-playing game elements incorporated. During the game, you could collect the in-game currency known as Zenny to help upgrade your abilities. Tamayo Kawamoto was a prominent composer for Capcom in the 80s, primarily working on their arcade games. She was also among the first set of employees hired by Capcom. Unfortunately, some games did not give her any credits, which was normal for Capcom to do at the time. Her first scores were for the game San-San and Pirate Ship Higimaru. She frequently collaborated with Ayako Mori, who was also a prominent composer for Capcom in the 80s. Forgotten Worlds helped introduce Capcom to the hardware capabilities it would need to help make Capcom one of the most established arcade game companies in the video game industry. The game did not sell well as it was too expensive to mass-produce the chips needed for CPS-1 games. But that would not stop Capcom, as they would continue to produce games that used the CPS-1 board, leading to their monumental success with Street Fighter II. This series is notorious for exemplifying insanely difficult gaming experiences long before anything Hidetaka Miyazaki directed. Ghosts and Goblins is not just the name of this series. It is a literal description of the types of enemies that will first destroy all of your armor in one hit, forcing you to trek in your briefs, before making you explode in a pile of skeleton bones in one additional hit. And did I mention that you have to endure the entirety of this arduous experience twice just to finish the game one time? The legacy of this game goes beyond the difficult gameplay. It extends to the music, specifically 2 of the pieces in the soundtrack. One, the brief map theme, setting the tone for the treacherous level you will play, and the first level theme. Both pieces recurring across the entire Ghosts and Goblins series. These iconic pieces, in addition to the rest of the score from the first game, were composed by Ayako Mori, one of the first composers to work for Capcom. Based on a roundtable interview with Beep magazine translated by Shmuplations, the development of the game's score wasn't an easy one. Mori felt as if the music department was given the least priority over all of the other groups that contributed to the development of the game. She also had to work with people who had little to no knowledge on music terminology, making communication between composer and developer tough. A lot of the ideas she came up with for her scores came from sleeping at the Capcom offices. She also felt that there were excuses for other parts of the game to not go well or be late in development. Yet, if the music was off or late, there were no excuses. The development of the score, based on Mori's own experiences, were much harsher than anything the player experienced when playing the actual game. The first game was ported to multiple consoles, and with each port came new composers who arranged Mori's score. When the game was ported to the Nintendo, the arrangement was handled by Harumi Fujita. When the game was ported to the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, the arrangement was handled by Mark Kupski, whose rendition of the score had to rely on Frederick Chopin's Prelude No. 20 due to the console not being able to handle the original score. When the game was ported to the Amstrad CPC, the arrangement was handled by David Whittaker. When the game was ported to the Game Boy Color, the arrangement was handled by Alistair Brimble. The second game, Ghouls and Ghosts, was composed by Forgotten Worlds composer Tomoyo Kawamoto. There were few differences between the first and the second game. It did establish Mori's haunted graveyard theme as a recurring leitmotif in the series, as well as the map theme that plays before each attempt at a stage. Unlike the previous game, not as many composers were needed to either arrange or adapt Kawamoto's score. While Kawamoto handled some of the console ports herself, notably the successful Genesis port, the computer ports were handled by Tim Follin, who also took some liberties in composing new scores for the game as well. Follin was one of arguably the most popular Western composers of the 80s and 90s, known for his works on the 80s computer systems, and for games like Silver Surfer for the Nintendo and Plock for the Super Nintendo. The games and the development of these games were harsh, to put it mildly. Despite the tough development cycles, the games and their scores remain one of Capcom's most important titles. No game, past or present, has come close to putting gamers through so much effort just to finish the game a first time. And with a score that emphasizes the horror aesthetic above everything else, the experience becomes just as haunting as it is a daunting experience. By the time development on Golden Axe started, fantasy stories were becoming popular. The Conan films were big, and Dragon Quest helped define the role-playing game genre. Producer Makoto Uchida, who had also helped develop Sega's Altered Beast, wanted to combine his fascination with the Conan movies with a game he felt would be the arcade fantasy competitor to the console Dragon Quest game, with the beat-em-up scroller type of gaming that had been popular with arcades at the time. During his time with Sega, Yu Takada kept a very low profile. Barely anything was known about him. He only worked on a handful of Sega arcade games before leaving the company. The only composer with a known profile that has an attachment to Golden Axe is Heron Tell, otherwise known as Wave, who worked on the Commodore 64 port of Golden Axe. It wasn't quite the same as the arcade soundtrack, but Tell's version helped solidify him as one of the best composers that worked on the Commodore 64. He was initially inspired by other Commodore 64 composers Ron Hubbard and Martin Galway, but he prefers composing in his own style as opposed to trying to emulate someone he admires. Golden Axe was ported to other consoles, but the commonly used soundtrack was Takada's original arcade score. Altered Beast may have set a standard for the beat-em-up style of games, but it was Golden Axe that became their definitive beat-em-up game at the arcades. With music to help enhance Uchida's love for fantasy, or music to support Commodore 64's potential for music played on its games, Golden Axe became a standard for the beat-em-up genre as well as the standard for fantasy music. Miki Higashino was only 5 when she started to study music. She joined the composition department at her school as she felt that she wasn't good enough to be a performer. The department she studied composition at looked down at her strong minimalist approach to composition. It affected her mood and her passion. However, Konami's search for a part-time composer caught her attention. She composed some demos, not knowing one thing about game music, and was hired. She felt that Konami was the one place where she could best express her passion. Her first project was Gradius. At the time, there weren't many people working in the sound department of Konami. Higashino was able to compose Gradius in her own way, with no direction from anyone else. As this game was a side-scrolling shooter that took place entirely in space, Higashino's approach to the score was based on her own idea of what space meant. To her, space equaled computers, robots, the future, and anything else that fit those categories. Composition techniques such as Lydian mode, the 7-tone music scale that rises in pitches, odd meters, which are meters that contain simple and compound beats, and rapid arpeggios, a quick succession of 3 to 4 notes played one after another, were all used to help compose the entire score. Gradius would go on to become one of Konami's flagship franchises. However, Higashino would only be involved with the first game as the only composer, and again in Gradius 3 as part of the Konami Kukihai Club. Higashino would define her career outside of Gradius with scores for games in the Ninja Turtle series like the original arcade game and the Genesis version of Tournament Fighters. She also lent her talents to the first 2 Suikoden games, with the second one being what she would consider her representative work. Miki Higashino was one of Konami's first composers and one of the first notable female composers to contribute to a game which would end up becoming popular and beloved years after its release. Her influence on Konami and the video game industry began with a risk to help revitalize a passion in music, and with the opportunity to compose Gradius, she made the score her own, and that helped shape Gradius and helped establish Konami as a developer capable of producing memorable music for their games. After starting his career in Konami, which includes working on the popular NES port of Contra, Sada left Konami to join Natsume. As part of Natsume, Sada would work on a game that would ultimately define his career, as well as a game that helped innovate a genre rarely seen in video games at the time: Idol Hakkenden, a text-based adventure game about a girl who must compete with her family to inherit her grandmother's fortune. To do this, she pursues a career as an idol. In Japan, idols are young celebrities who are marketed as actors, models, entertainers, and most significantly, singers. Text adventures were exactly as they sounded, interactive stories relying only on text. But Idol Hakkenden was among the first, specifically in the console market, to incorporate visuals into text adventures, thus becoming an early example of what would become the visual novel genre. The soundtrack is a mix of simple, easygoing background music, plus arrangements of classical music like Toccata and Fugue in D minor, and chip-tuned J-pop music to fit the mood of idol culture, as well as the music performed by main protagonist Erika. The J-pop music even incorporates the sounds of a live audience clapping and cheering to the beat of the music, invoking the feeling of listening to the music performed live. The lyrics to Erika's songs are displayed at the bottom of the screen and timed to match when the lyrics are sung. After 1993, Sada left Natsume to form a music composition company called Pure Sound, producing music for the majority of Japanese entertainment, from video games to pachinko machines. In 2011, Ho-Ho Records, through Pure Sound Studio, released an arrangement album of Idol Hakkenden's songs, actually performed by idols Satoa Tanaka, Mikami Haruka, and Morei Chiaki. Everything about Idol Hakkenden represented an innovation for video games and video game music, and despite its hardware limitations, it managed to capture idol culture in a way that was charming and cute. And as an interactive adventure, it helped provide baby steps towards a genre that would become more and more popular as the methods of playing video games continued to improve. Hirokazu Hip Tanaka was one of Nintendo's first sound designers, joining the company before Koji Kondo. Tanaka had grown up with music all his life. He performed in various bands throughout his school years, including bands that did cover music of the Beatles and Elton John. Tanaka was also heavily invested in the reggae genre, joining a reggae band that even got to open for the group Sly and Robbie. In 1980, Tanaka joined Nintendo as a sound designer for what he thought would be an easy job, making sound effects for toys. He wound up making a sound chip for Nintendo and designing sound effects for some of Nintendo's earliest titles, most notably being the sound effects designer for the original Donkey Kong. He didn't actually get to compose music for Nintendo until Donkey Kong 3 in 1983. His style of music mirrored that of his passion for reggae music, often incorporating only percussion and bass into his music. 1986 would prove to be Tanaka's most significant year with Nintendo at that point. Two of their most notable entries to their first-party lineup were both composed by Tanaka himself, Metroid and this game, Kid Icarus. Released in Japan as Light Mythology Palutena's Mirror, game director Satoru Okada had always been fascinated with Greek mythology. Originally meant to have a more serious tone, the game did take inspiration from Greek mythology while simultaneously incorporating strange and humorous additions, including a few suggested by Tanaka himself, like the Speck-Nosed Enemy, which was allegedly modeled after Tanaka himself. Hirokazu Hip Tanaka helped Nintendo develop some of its more unique music and sounds, and while Kid Icarus wasn't a runaway smash, it did eventually get a revival of sorts thanks to its representation in the Smash series and the sequel developed by Smash Bros. Director Masahiro Sakurai. The Legend of Zelda, one of Nintendo's most prestigious franchises. While Mario was a more linear game, Zelda was meant to be very non-linear, forcing the player to think carefully about where to go and what to do next. Koji Kondo, who had previously composed Nintendo's Super Mario Bros., was assigned to this game 2 weeks after the original release of Super Mario Bros. In September 1985. With instructions like short background music, fanfare, and sparkly, Kondo set to compose a score that was drastically different than what he achieved in his previous game. Originally, Kondo planned on using Maurice Ravel's Bolero as the game's main theme. Upon discovering that the copyright on Bolero hadn't expired, Kondo composed an original piece instead. A piece that would ultimately define the Zelda franchise as a whole throughout a majority of its history. The Legend of Zelda was originally released on the Famicom Disk System as a launch title. The game was converted to the far more limited Nintendo cartridge for the North American release, reducing the audio quality of the majority of the score from the game. The Adventure of Link was not like the previous game. Experience points were added, magic spells were used at the cost of magic points displayed by a magic meter, the overworld was presented a la Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, and the actual interaction with enemies or the non-playable characters was presented as a side-scroller. The Adventure of Link did not feature Koji Kondo. Instead, the score was done by Akito Nakatsuka. Nakatsuka, like Kondo, helped score many of Nintendo's memorable titles in the 80s. Some of Nakatsuka's contributions include Excitebike, Ice Climber, and the Nintendo version of Punch-Out! The score did not feature any of Kondo's pieces from the previous game. However, the temple piece increased in popularity due to arrangements appearing in the Smash Bros. Series, as well as the Nintendo 3DS Zelda, A Link Between Worlds. The Legend of Zelda's beginnings were a mix of innovation, curiosity, and experimenting, all three of which would become signature approaches to each addition to the Zelda franchise. Koji Kondo's score especially became a standard bearer for how every Zelda game, whether he composed it or not, should sound. If any franchise from the Nintendo era were to define the potential of the Nintendo sound chip, it would be Mega Man. Consistently, Mega Man has been highly regarded for its soundtrack from various composers, regardless of the quality of each game, and it all started with Manami Matsume. As a young child, listening to her father playing the acoustic guitar struck inspiration within her. She took music classes, learned the piano and the organ, and aspired to be a piano teacher after college. She later found out that Capcom had been hiring music composers. As someone who was interested in music from the Mario and Dragon Quest games, she was interested in the opportunity. Her first project for Capcom was one piece for the game Jisen Mahjong, along with Harumi Fujita, who would ironically end up composing 3 pieces from the Mega Man 3 score. It was Capcom's way of easing Matsume into working a music composition job for them. After Jisen Mahjong, she got her first job as a primary composer, Mega Man. While a lot of composers struggled with Nintendo's limitations, Matsume had little trouble composing within the Nintendo hardware's limits. She attributes this to her fondness of learning and performing Sebastian Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier, which could easily be performed with no more than 4 sound chips. The only amount of stress she had was the pieces that relied on percussion to carry the beat. She had to listen to then popular percussionists like Phil Collins to help give her an idea of how to translate a good percussion to the Nintendo system. Although multiple composers contributed to different Mega Man games, the piece that plays when a Robot Master is selected has been the most reprised piece in the original Mega Man series. And although she is the name often attached to Mega Man in regards to the music, it was Takashi Tateshi's score for Mega Man 2 that wound up becoming one of the most popular in the series, as well as one of the most popular scores in the entire Nintendo library. When Matsume transitioned to the arcade department, the sequel needed a new composer. Takeshi Tateshi was a piano player through his life and performed keyboard for a local band, but never achieved the pro level of fame. Despite this, and despite not having a degree in arts which was required by Capcom, he applied for an experienced worker position at Capcom and was hired after impressing the studio with his demo tapes and his knowledge of music. His first game with Capcom was the game Mad Gear. Immediately after, he worked on Mega Man 2, a game that Capcom developed in 3 months. Already a fan of the first Mega Man and Matsume's score, he sought to live up to what Matsume had achieved with the first game. Matsume even managed to contribute a small portion of Airman's stage theme to the score. Initially, the majority of his score was rejected for sounding more cute than cool. Out of his initial batch, only one piece was approved, Crashman's stage theme. Arguably, the most popular piece from the entire game is the first Dr. Wily stage theme. It was even appreciated by the game's director Akira Kitamura, who suggested making another piece similar to it. That piece became Woodman's stage theme. The first Dr. Wily stage theme was so well received, it re-emerged in 2007 as a lyrical arrangement uploaded to Nico Nico Doga by user Blue Fang called Omowade wa Okusenman, a song not about Mega Man, but about Ultra 7 fans growing from child to adult. The most notable version of this song was recorded by Jam Project as a bonus track for the album Nico Nico Doga Selection Saino no Mudazuki, A Waste of Talent. The first two Mega Man games set a standard for memorable, innovative, and catchy scores for video games. Mega Man 2 raised the bar so high for Nintendo, few games, let alone their scores, matched the legacy that the game continues to relish in even to this day. The score for this game may be short. Very short. Roughly 10 minutes long, in fact. But it is still regarded as one of the greatest scores in video games from the 80s, as well as a prime example of the sound potential of the Commodore 64. Rob Hubbard was a guitarist since the age of 7. All his life, he had worked as a professional musician. Whether it's playing in a band, arranging, or transcribing, he was more than capable of doing his work. And this was before he joined the video game industry. He worked on what he describes as music educational software for the C64. He couldn't actually make a profit off what he had worked on, which served as a motivator to work on video games. He actually wrote a complete video game, but the company he made the game for went bankrupt. What impressed people the most was the audio work, specifically the first game studio he worked on, Gremlin Graphics. As a primary composer for Gremlin Graphics, he composed much of C64's most memorable scores, including Commando, Knuckle Busters, Warhawk, Sanjian, and of course, Monty on the Run. The main theme is reported to be an inspiration of Charles Williams' The Devil's Gallop, the main theme of the radio thriller series Dick Barton. Hubbard doesn't consider his score for the game to be his best work, but acknowledges that its fast-paced energy helped make the score resonate with so many people back then, Commodore 64 fans, and to video game music enthusiasts today. Rob Hubbard became the standard for how music should sound on the Commodore 64. His passion for music, his dedication to the craft, and his willingness to put the game itself before his own personal feelings helped amplify the experience of playing the Commodore 64, and helped make such scores like the one for Monty on the Run become one of the 80s most memorable video game scores. Mother was an unusual game. It took gameplay mechanics inspired by Dragon Quest, but set the story in the United States and told the story in a way that humorously spoofed the tropes of Japanese role-playing games. Outside of Japan, this series didn't see the light of day until 1995 with its Super Nintendo sequel, Earthbound. This game, originally released in 1989, was not released outside of Japan until June 2015 as a Wii U Virtual Console title under the name Earthbound Beginnings. Hirokazu Hip Tanaka had already established himself as an integral part of Nintendo's music history, contributing to the original Donkey Kong series, establishing franchises like Metroid, Kid Icarus, and composing scores for other memorable titles like Duck Hunt, Balloon Fight, Wrecking Crew, and Super Mario Land for the Game Boy. Mother would not sound like any of those games. It is odd, ethereal, a weird mix of both, haunting, and melodic. The main plot of this game is to recover the missing song of Magicent's ruler, Queen Mary. The missing song is scattered across the world as 8 different melodies. The melodies would serve as important plot devices, which would later help the protagonist team defeat the game's main antagonist, Gygus. All of this may sound very familiar to Earthbound fans. Yes, Earthbound followed a fairly similar plot, but was more successful in its implementation. However, it was Mother that started the concept of finding melodies in small rural America while fighting various oddities. It was also the first video game score of Keiichi Suzuki. Suzuki began his professional music career in the 70s as part of the bands Hachimitsu Pai, the Moonriders, and the Beatniks with one of the Yellow Magic Orchestra founders. As a video game composer, he only worked on the Mother series with Tanaka, except for Mother 3. In addition to those two games, he also composed the game Real Sound Kaze no Regret, a game specifically targeted to blind players in Japan. Primarily, Suzuki is a film composer, composing scores for memorable films like Uzumaki, Tokyo Godfathers, and Beat Takeshi's Outrage trilogy. Suzuki's experience with the Nintendo hardware wasn't completely a positive one, as he struggled with the 3-note limit of the hardware. Some of the pieces in Mother were reprised and arranged in the other Mother games. Pollyanna, Snowman, Humoresque of a Little Dog are just a few examples of what was reprised. The Earthbound piece, New Age Retro Hippie, is an arrangement of Mother's third battle theme. Mother had a weird release history. While Japan got to experience all of it, including the re-releases, the rest of the world got Earthbound and had to wait 20 years to experience the beginning of the Mother series. Mother 3, on the other hand, was never officially released in Japan. Whether it's the allure of experiencing the entire trilogy, wanting more of a game like Earthbound, or whether you're just looking for a quirky role-playing game, Mother has you covered. And with Mother comes a score from one of Nintendo's most established composers, and one of Japan's most experienced composers. Sega had become one of the more dominant developers of arcade games in the 80s, largely due to Yu Suzuki and his ability to produce and direct unique arcade experiences like Hang-On and Space Harrier. OutRun was Suzuki's opportunity to create a car racing game as opposed to a motorcycle one. OutRun was only developed by himself, 4 other programmers, the sound designer, and the composer Hiroshi Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi initially had a strong dislike for music due to the music lessons he took and couldn't find success with at a young age. His appreciation for music started to grow when he became invested in the folk music genre. It was then where he became a self-taught musician and learned how to play the guitar and perform in bands. After high school, he shifted his instrument of choice to the synthesizer keyboard. In addition to knowing how to play instruments, he also knew how to program his own games and scores for those games using the Commodore VIC 1001. He eventually found work with Sega as a programmer. His first game was Girl's Garden for the Master System. He started composing for Suzuki and his arcade games when Suzuki learned of Kawaguchi's experience playing in bands. Suzuki wanted the sound of his game Hang-On to sound like something you'd hear a real band play on the radio. For OutRun, the relationship between Kawaguchi and Suzuki grew. What separated OutRun from Suzuki's other games was the ability to choose what music was played in the background while you raced. There were only 3 to choose from, but each piece lasted roughly as long as it would take to finish the entire game from start to finish. The 4th piece, Last Wave, was meant to end the game whether you won or got a time over on a relaxing note. It wasn't enough for OutRun to be another innovative arcade experience from Yu Suzuki, scored by Hiroshi Kawaguchi. The option given to the player to decide what music would enhance the gaming experience was unique and unlike anything that had ever been done in any video game at the time. A tiny soundtrack by today's standards, but still one of the most innovative uses of a video game score in the 80s. Yuzo Koshiro was one of Nihon Falcom's most recognizable composers, composing scores for games like Ys 1 and 2, games in the Dragon Slayer series, and Sorcerian. Koshiro left Falcom in 1988 to focus on being a freelancer for other companies and studios. Despite contributing to PC Engine and Super Nintendo games, he would arguably be best known for the scores he contributed to Sega. The Revenge of Shinobi would become Koshiro's first score for a Sega game. Sega's Shinobi series started in 1987 with the arcade game originally composed by Yasuhiro Kawakami, followed by Shadow Dancer in 1989, the same year that the Shinobi series made its debut on the Genesis with Revenge of Shinobi. Before Sonic, Revenge of Shinobi was Sega's way of pushing the Genesis hardware to the limit, providing gameplay experiences that couldn't be replicated on any other platform. Because of the focus on console experience, the gameplay was different from the arcade games. Koshiro was already a fan of the Shinobi arcade games, so he opted to compose an extension of the previous game's score while combining that extension with the kind of music he was listening to at the time of development, citing Prince as a primary example of the kind of music that partially inspired the Revenge of Shinobi score. Revenge of Shinobi would only mark the beginning of Yuzo Koshiro's impactful career with Sega. He would return to the Shinobi series, providing the scores for the Game Gear games, the GG Shinobi, and the GG Shinobi 2 The Silent Fury. With the Revenge of Shinobi, Koshiro was able to show the Sega audience the kind of innovative music he was capable of producing, and how well he was able to express his love for club and dance music in music form, something that up until the release of Streets of Rage would be a huge yet rewarding risk on the part of Koshiro. It seemed like video game consoles were a fad after the Atari shock, also known as the video game crash of 1983. But in 1985, 2 years after the original release of the Famicom, Super Mario Bros. Was released. It was promoted as a platformer that gradually eased the player from getting used to the controls and how the gameplay mechanics work to being experienced enough to survive the game's later, tougher levels. It would become one of, if not, the most successful video game release in terms of the impact this game had on the industry. Part of the legacy behind the first Super Mario Bros. Could be attributed to Koji Kondo's score for the game. Kondo studied and played music since he was 5. He specialized in the electric organ, and as he grew, he would play in cover bands that played progressive rock music. When he enrolled in the Osaka University of Arts, he learned how to compose and arrange music. Nintendo recruited at his university, seeking someone experienced in music. Kondo applied and joined the sound team already consisting of Hirokazu Hiptanaka and Yukio Kaneoka. What separated Kondo from these two was that he was hired based on his experience with music, while the others were hired based on their programming. His first video game score was for the arcade version of Punch-Out! He continued working on arcade and console games for Nintendo until he got the opportunity to score Super Mario Bros. For this game, Kondo wanted to do something that hadn't been commonly done in video games: make the music complement the game. Kondo was able to achieve this by composing the music while the game was being developed, which at the time was very rare, as composers would normally score their respective games after the base game is finished. Kondo was also able to compose pieces that fit the mood of the style of the stages Mario was in, as well as keeping in mind the fun factor behind the game, wanting to compose music that could be listened to for a long time without becoming repetitive. An example of how committed he was to complementing the mood of the game with the music was changing the signature to 3-4 meters for the underground theme, as he felt that the 3-4 time signature would help make the underground levels more unsettling. And for the original athletic theme, he established what Twitter user PixelT perfectly described as the Koji Kondo hook, a unique introduction separate from the rest of the melody to immediately catch the attention of the listener. Koji Kondo and the Super Mario Bros. Score influenced the way video game music was approached. Mood was a rarely invoked trait of video game music at the time, usually only serving as background noise. Kondo changed that, and with how successful Super Mario Bros. Was for the video game industry, many people's first experience in video game music, as well as the first standard bearer for video game music was this game and Kondo's score. The aim of this sequel was to make a Nintendo game that could be compared to the kind of games that the Amiga, Commodore 64, and the Atari ST were capable of, which was far more when compared to the Nintendo, especially in the late 80s. It was also meant to be a side-scrolling game with role-playing elements like currency, shops where you could purchase healing items or equipment, and it even has a gambling mini-game. David Wise, who composed the previous game in the Wizards and Warriors series, his second game score ever, returned to score this game. David Wise had been a composer for Rare since 1985, meeting Rare founders Tim and Chris Stamper at his workplace, a music shop where he was promoting the Yamaha CX5 music computer. The Stamper brothers were impressed with his programming knowledge and his ability to compose within the limits of the music computer, so they offered him a job at Rare. His first score was Slalom, which when working with the NES sound chip, sounded very basic. But over time, with help from his Rare co-workers, he learned how to push the Nintendo sound chip to the limit, composing scores like the first Wizards and Warriors game, Marble Madness, and of course this game. Ironsword not only pushed the graphics of the Nintendo, but also pushed the sound capabilities of the Nintendo sound chip, which would become something that Wise would be known for throughout the 90s, being able to go beyond the hardware he was working with. There were so many samples used in the game that it would be more common for some sound samples to drop while playing the game than it would for other games at the time. But for its faults, there were some technical achievements. For example, the crescendo in the Earth Elemental battle theme. Crescendos on Nintendo scores were almost impossible to pull off, and it would not become a notable trait in NES scores until Koichi Sugiyama used crescendos in his score for Dragon Quest IV. The Icefire Mountain piece would be one of the more unusual pieces. It would be more cheerful than the rest of the soundtrack, and it would end up being used as the main piece to end the game. It would be the piece used in the final area, the piece used in the final battle, and the piece used in the staff roll, all seamlessly without a single fade out until you got a game over, or until the game went back to the title screen at the end of the staff roll. The score for Ironsword would be just as technically advanced as it would be experimental. It wouldn't be David Wise's most well-known score, but it would be one that helped do what Wise would become known for, not letting the limits of hardware stop him from composing how he wanted to compose. With Wizardry, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy becoming innovators of the role-playing game genre, it seemed like there wasn't room in the genre for another innovation. Ys, Ancient Ys Vanished would end up pushing the role-playing game genre further than what was initially thought possible. The gameplay was drastically different from the aforementioned role-playing games, but not to a point where it would be compared to the original Legend of Zelda. But a major part of what separated Ys from the other role-playing games was that its score did not sound like other role-playing games. Much of it sounded more upbeat, exciting, and energetic than dramatic and ambient. The first game was originally composed by Yuzo Koshiro and Maiko Ishikawa. Yuzo Koshiro learned how to play the piano at an early age from his mother and from a young Joe Hisaishi before becoming self-taught. He was inspired by games like Gradius, Space Harrier, and the Tower of Jiraga to get into video game music scoring as a hobby before joining Nihon Falcom. He would be the composer for most of Ys 1. Maiko Ishikawa was not as well known as Yuzo Koshiro, but was still a huge part of Falcom's history. Her first score with them was this game, and she continues to be involved with Falcom, with her most recent score being the 2006 Guruman, A Monstrous Adventure, as part of Sound Team JDK. She was also involved with the staff of the latter Ys titles, as well as the Legend of Heroes series. Ys 2 Ancient Ys Vanished, the final chapter, which picks up immediately after where the previous game ended, adds Hideo Nagata to the composer lineup. Ys 2 would be the only Falcom game that Nagata would score for. He would later be known for his scores in the games Bosconian, Lemmings, Draken, Motor Tune Grand Prix, and the Fighter's Destiny games. In Ys 2, it would be Ishikawa who would compose the majority of the game. The more popular compilation release, simply titled Ys 1 and 2, combines the two Ys games into one with remastered graphics, fully voiced cutscenes, and a remastered soundtrack done in the Red Book audio format. The entire remastering was handled by Ryo Yonemitsu. Despite only arranging Koshiro, Ishikawa, and Nagata scores, Yonemitsu's arrangement and conversion to the Red Book audio format would raise the bar for how not just Ys would sound, but would raise the bar for how PC Engine games would sound in general, as the sound quality offered back then was above and beyond what any other hardware was capable of producing at the time. And when the first two Ys games are brought up, it's normally the Ys 1 and 2 arrangements that are brought up, and not the original scores themselves, perhaps due to how much more accessible Ys 1 and 2 is than the original games. However, with the release of Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles for the PlayStation Portable in 2009, an option was given to allow players to listen to the original versions of the scores, an arrangement of the score done for Windows in 2001, or a brand new arrangement done exclusively for the PSP release. The Ys games did many things that video games back then couldn't do. The Ys games also had the kind of score that wasn't very common in its type of game back in the day. It would be a trend that Ys would continue to follow to this very day, and would be the kind of music that inspired scores of other role-playing games like the Tales of and Lunar games. It was also one of the first exposures to Yuzo Koshiro's career as a composer. Although he would be more known for his freelance work, his place in the history of Ys helped give the series some of its most iconic pieces. And that concludes the 80s edition of the M-Disc Playlist VGM Primer. Follow me on Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch under M-Disc Playlist. For updates on my future or ongoing projects, check out my website via the link in my show notes. I am Nitro, good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.